In 2005, Steve Jobs gave the commencement address to Stanford's graduating class. And like many commencement speakers, he had some things to say about life after college. He said, "Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle." So, this is a message that probably sounds familiar to many of you. Some version of it is ingrained in us from a very young age. Find your passion, do what you love, and you'll never work a day in your life. Now, while this sounds pretty good, I'd like to suggest that this message is actually terrible. We should completely reject it, and we should approach work with a different mindset altogether. So, what is this message, and why is it bad? At its core, it's that what you do for a living is your only vehicle for a good, meaningful life. So if you want a good, meaningful life, you have to find a job that you love. It's kind of everywhere. And I think it's related to our cultural understanding that what you do for a living is also, to some degree, who you are. It's common for us to ask young children what they want to be when they grow up. When we meet someone new, one of the first things we want to know about them is what their job is. Fairly or not, it forms the basis for a lot of our initial judgments about that person. And it's true that work does fill a large part of our lives, so it would be weird to just ignore it. But somehow we wound up thinking about work in such a way that what Steve Jobs said sounds pretty reasonable, that a satisfying life is impossible without a job you love. But it's not reasonable. It's actually kind of a weird idea. And it's not good. First of all, a job isn't something you do for fun. Most people have to work to live. At its most basic level, a job is an arrangement between you and someone else. It's an agreement that you'll do work in exchange for money. It could be teaching middle school geometry, or doing research for a nonprofit, or making and selling art, or any number of things. But what makes it a job is that you're doing the thing in order to get paid. So what happens if we're told from early childhood that a job is more than that? That it's a reflection of who you are, and even if we listen to Steve Jobs, your only shot at a meaningful life? What happens for most people is their job doesn't provide a deep sense of meaning. Most people don't love their job. Most jobs aren't lovable. They're not meant to be. And even the jobs that are supposed to be done for love, if you have to do them to live, it's hard to sustain love for them in the long term. So this leads to three things. The first one is disappointment. The gap between all the things that work is supposed to be, all the things it's supposed to give you, and what it actually does provide is a recipe for disappointment. It's also a recipe for the second thing, shame. Steve Jobs was very clear in his address. Don't settle. If your job gives you a paycheck, but it doesn't also give you a sense of purpose and fulfillment, then you've settled. So not only are you doomed to a life without the satisfaction only great work can provide, it's your fault for settling for just a paycheck. And that can start to look and feel a lot like failure. And the third thing that happens is you'll work harder and longer. If you believe that a meaningful job is your only real shot at a meaningful life, then you're probably going to do whatever you can to make that job meaningful. And what that tends to look like is putting more time and effort into it. And this is the one I want to focus on because while disappointment and shame are obviously bad, there's nothing self-evidently wrong with working harder and longer. What's wrong with that, right? What's wrong with being invested in your work? And I don't think that there is anything wrong with that by itself. But let's think about those extra hours and effort and dedication. Do they come back to you in the form of fulfillment and meaning? Maybe. I think more likely and more often what comes back to you is burnout. If you pour everything you are and everything you have into a job, it's probably not sustainable in the long run. And also, there's someone else involved too, your boss or the organization you work for. And while you might get something out of your extra work, they definitely get something out of it for no additional cost. Have you ever wondered why it's so common for job descriptions to specify that they're looking for someone who's passionate about the work on like pretty much any job description? If you voluntarily work harder and longer because you feel like you're supposed to love the job, or because you do love the job, then they get extra work out of you for free. So earlier I said that a job is an arrangement, labor for money. But for some reason, a lot of workplaces operate as if the arrangement is labor for money and something else, something intangible. And this is especially true in fields that are supposed to be about love or passion. The mentality is, you're so lucky to have the opportunity to work at such and such a nonprofit. Or how wonderful for you that you get to have a job as a children's librarian. That's such a meaningful career. Never mind the $30,000 a year salary. You're here for passion. The idea that a job's natural function is to provide both a paycheck and personal fulfillment slips pretty easily into the idea that if your job is only for a paycheck, then you won't be able to have a satisfying life. And that way lies disappointment, shame, and what else? More work. So I hope you'll agree that this is bad, but there is an objection I think a lot of people will raise here. What if you genuinely like and believe in the organization you work for? What if you are a children's librarian or work at an important nonprofit, or are a teacher or something like that? So some people might be thinking, yes, I do put in more hours and effort than I technically am required to, but it is because I believe in the cause. The extra work I do furthers that cause. It doesn't just produce wealth for some greedy capitalist owner. Doesn't that matter? And I think the answer is yes, that does matter, but something else matters too. Suppose you start working for a nonprofit right out of college. You work 50 or 60 hours every week. You take none or almost none of your PTO. You give your all to this organization. And after 3 years, you can't do it anymore. You're totally burnt out. So you quit. So what happens then is the nonprofit hires a new fresh college grad to replace you, because there's a huge pool of them applying to nonprofit jobs just like this all the time. And the cycle continues. So obviously that's a great deal for the nonprofit, or even for the cause, but at what cost? So back to the question, doesn't it matter that the extra work is for a good cause instead of some rich owner? Yes. But my question is, don't you matter? Are you so unimportant that it doesn't matter if an organization requires you to sacrifice everything else just for the privilege of being able to work there? If you work for a cause you believe in, I'm happy for you. But no matter what the cause is, it shouldn't have to be in competition with your ability to live your life outside of work. At the end of the day, I don't know what your job is like, but I hope you'll at least consider that when we approach work with the intention of making it the source of our deepest fulfillment, we're offering something to our jobs that our jobs are not offering us in return. So I've titled this video, Should You Love Your Job? And I think by now it's probably clear that I think the answer is no. Or at least I don't think you should actively try to find a job you love and then consider it a failure if and when you don't. And I could leave it at that, and I think that would be just fine. But I think if we're going to change the way we approach work, we can't just reject the culture around loving your job. We really should have something new to replace it. I mention this because I'm not the first one to point out the problems of the demand that we love our jobs. If you search, I don't have a dream job, or I don't dream of labor on YouTube, you'll find plenty of videos that offer various critiques of the cultural messaging that I've been talking about here. By and large, these videos fall into two camps. They either offer critiques without solutions, or they offer active non-solutions, like monetizing your hobbies or finding ways to generate passive income. It's not really worth going into here, but I will at least say that monetizing your hobbies is just getting a different job. And by all means, get a different job, but it's a pretty individualistic solution to a larger cultural problem. And it also doesn't solve the problem of feeling like we have to love our jobs. As for establishing passive income streams, I mean, most people can't do that. So maybe we're trying to solve different problems, but I just feel like I should mention it. If you can establish passive income streams and escape work, then good for you, I guess. But it's also not a solution to our problem. So for those of you who are sympathetic to the problems I've laid out here, I'd like to suggest a new approach. That approach is pride. A good relationship with work should be characterized by pride, not love. Love is something that we give to people, our friends, our family members, people in our communities. And the thing about love is it's reciprocal. Friends and family can love you back. And really, that's a big part of what sustains those bonds and those relationships. But no matter how much you love your job will never, ever love you back. Pride is a little different. For one thing, it doesn't need to be returned. That's not how pride functions or sustains itself. In the case of work, pride can come from the recognition that your labor is important and good. So if you think about your job, you can likely find something about it that you can take pride in, even if you don't love it. So if you're a teacher, you can take pride in the important work of educating people, even when you aren't feeling love for the work. If you're a barista, you can take pride in providing a service that people rely on, even if you don't love being a barista. Also, if you can make the mental shift toward emphasizing pride in your work instead of love, you might gain something else too. I think you could gain a greater sense of clarity about the transactional nature of a job. I said it earlier, and it's worth repeating. A job is an exchange, labor for money. If you take pride in your work, and if that pride comes from an understanding of the value of your work, then the idea that you should accept personal fulfillment or something like that as some portion of your compensation, even if that's just implied, that idea starts to sound pretty weird and maybe even a little insulting. So we move from, I love my job, so I'm putting in extra work for personal fulfillment, to my job is important and the work I do is valuable, and I deserve the respect to be paid for every minute of it. Of course, it's one thing to say, let's stop trying to love our jobs and instead start taking pride in them. It's harder to do. The culture around loving your work just runs so deep. Even if you mostly agree with the things I've said here, we can't all just flip a switch in our brains and just decide to ignore years or decades of cultural messaging. So what's the best way to actually make this shift? I think the number one thing to do is talk to your coworkers. Have conversations about what it is you're hoping to get from work. Is it just a paycheck, or is it something more? Why? Do you feel love or passion for the work? What about pride? Compare notes. Do others feel pressured to work longer and harder than they're technically signed on for? If so, what would happen if you all decided not to do that for a week or a month? Talking to your coworkers is really a powerful thing, and I think that's where this shift can start. And of course, it's good to talk with people outside the workplace too. So if you're a student, have these conversations with your classmates. Talk about these things with your friends or your family, or with strangers online in the comments section. Before I finish this up, I do want to make a few things clear. First, if you hate your job, there's nothing wrong with trying to find a different one. While I don't think there's any need to love your job, work should at least be bearable. On the other hand, I'm also not saying that there's anything wrong with having a career or a vocation. Some people really do feel called to particular work, and they do get personal fulfillment from it. And I really think that's fine. I just think it's strange for us to think that everyone does, or that everyone should. So to sum up, if you don't love your job and you're dissatisfied because you feel like you're supposed to, then the problem probably isn't you or the job itself, but rather the cultural expectations surrounding work and how those expectations have become your expectations. If you do love your job and you're getting burnt out, you deserve better than a work environment that demands more than you can sustainably give, no matter how important the cause is or how lucky you feel you are to be working at that particular job. But whatever your current relationship with work is, I promise there is more to life than what happens at a job. You can be happy and fulfilled from the parts of your life outside the thing you do to pay the bills. Steve Jobs says something interesting later on in that 2005 commencement address that I think is worth repeating here. He says, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking." I couldn't agree more.